Hey, this is the Spiritable podcast. It's hosted by myself, Luke David, and my sweet baby boy, Richard Glenn. Richard is getting his master's in theology, and I have absolutely no marketable skills and a few concerning moles. We are talking about spirituality and everyday life struggles through our super non-traditional Christian background, and we're going to drag in some guests from different backgrounds to get their perspective and some variety. It's stupid that these things can't be fun and casual to talk about, so we're just going to do that ourselves. We just started, so we have like 0 people listening or watching, but we are having a blast anyway. Bam, here we go. Okay, so let's just dive into it.
Cool. Welcome, audience.
Thank you for watching. We're kind of a weird podcast this week because we don't have any guests. And why is that? Because Chelsea sucked.
Yeah, Chelsea was garbage.
No,
Just kidding, Chelsea. We love you.
She's
She's not going to watch this anyway. She doesn't care about us.
She doesn't care. We could say anything.
Yeah. Let's get into it.
And we're also in a new location because life happened and we couldn't get into the thrift shop. So we're shooting in this janky place. I love the word janky.
We also don't have our Ben behind the camera today.
It's true. It's literally just me and Richard in a room looking at a camera.
By ourselves. It feels different.
A little bit strange. But we're going to use this opportunity to get into more of a spiritual deep dive sort of thing. Because of our religion is a little bit different, we want to talk about some of the main differences and some cool things that we believe, hopefully cool, maybe a little bit strange, and we'll see where it goes. So Richard was talking to me beforehand, and you said that you just finished writing a paper because you're in theological school. Yeah. And so this, I'm sure this paper topic has been on your mind. So maybe we'll talk about that a little bit, and then I'll try to push back and see if it makes you feel like you failed your paper.
Cool.
I mean, I'll probably agree with you, but
yeah. Well, I just finished writing a paper on conscience, and it's a dope topic. One thing I really like about reading and studying my religion is that I feel like it has so much real world application so easily. And the stuff I was reading on conscience was really nuanced and cool and didn't feel like black and white. It felt like I could really apply it and like it really made sense in the real world application.
Yeah.
And it's super cool. So I wrote a paper about sort of what is conscience and how do we form or create a better conscience throughout our life.
That's interesting. So I feel like most people, I don't want to talk for everyone, but I feel like a lot of people think that conscience is kind of static. Like we just have this little voice in the back of our head that's like, no, don't do that. Or, yeah, go ahead. Go for it. You're a good person. But we can change our conscience. I just screwed it all up. Conscience. We can change our conscience.
The thing I probably learned most from my paper is how to spell the word conscience.
Did you do like a control find afterward and be like, 47 times you said conscience?
Oh, there were definitely more than 47. I mean, it was like a 3,000 word paper.
Did you not like at least thesaurus that? Or like...
No, because I'm talking about a doctrinal subject. I can't just throw other words around.
I feel like I'd get self-conscious about the amount of times that I wrote conscience.
Self-conscience.
Anyway, so because everyone has an idea of what conscience is. Is there a new church, quote unquote, definition of conscience?
Well, interestingly, there are a couple. But interestingly, a lot of the places in the sort of writings for the new church, it actually defines conscience by example instead of giving a definition. They do give definitions. I guess that goes back to what you're saying about being less black and white. Like if leading with examples rather than a strict definition. Well, yeah, which I think in that gray area a little bit. I think is a really cool take on it because I think definitions can be so constricting and so prone to like people who want loopholes can find them in a strict definition. Like, oh, well, it doesn't talk about this thing, so that is still living by my conscience, right. Or whatever. And it's like basically the examples that it gives. One of the first examples that it gives is, a person who has something that belongs to someone else and no one knows they have it. And so they won't receive any negative consequence of keeping it. still give it back because they know it's the right thing to do. That's a person that has conscience. That's basically what it says.
It sounds really vague.
Yeah, I mean, because it talks about a bunch of different examples. It talks about a judge in a court who gives a ruling based on justice instead of on taking a bribe or even doing something for a friend they have.
Yeah.
Acts on conscience. So these examples of basically the two main pieces of all of the examples are doing the right thing is acting on conscience, obviously, but then also doing it simply because it's the right thing. And I think there are a lot of things that can seem like conscience that aren't.
Well, I was about to say, it seems like this definition really just relates to a common sense.
Yeah.
Like obviously a judge should rule that way and not take bribes. Like that's just common sense. So is that what conscience is, or how does it differ from just this sort of universal common sense?
Well, I think that people can identify something as conscience that isn't.
Okay.
For example,
yeah, like what?
I sometimes identify not speeding as my conscience, and it is not. Because if I knew there were no cops on the road, you know
if
that
you were
I'd be
unrestrained
speeding.
by civil law.
Exactly. And that's not conscience. That's just fear of punishment. That's not you doing the right thing because it's right. That's you doing the right thing because you don't want the repercussions. And
so it relates sort of to a concept of charity. Like you doing good things are... You do good things when no one else can see you do good things. That's what makes a good thing. Not expecting any reward out of it. That's what truly makes a charitable action, or like builds your conscience.
Yeah, exactly. And it was, So I started my discussion of it talking about how sort of when people generally talk about conscience, they talk about it as this little voice.
Right.
And I think there's a lot of truth in that. I think it definitely is a little voice. And it's interesting that I think sometimes the little voice we hear in our head isn't conscience, and sometimes conscience doesn't appear as a little voice.
Well, let's dissect those a little bit then.
Yeah.
So, first one.
So I think sometimes the little voice we hear isn't conscience, because I think to the same extent that we sometimes hear a little voice saying, hey, you should really be being better, doing the right thing here. Sometimes we hear a little voice that's also like, doesn't matter, like it's just this one time, like you'll do better next time. It doesn't matter, like this voice of justification.
Yeah.
And I don't think people really mistake that for conscience unless you're pretty
I don't think people either.
confused.
But I think like if you look at those two things on paper, I'd be like, how do you tell a difference between those two? But I feel like it's a pretty universal thing for people to know the difference between a voice that's trying to justify their laziness or rudeness or something versus a conscience.
Yeah, and I think...
Which is interesting.
I think the more dogmatic the more like harshly dogmatic you become, the more those two things could be conflated. Because if you have... I think extremism of any kind is destructive.
So how does extremism blend that justifying voice and our conscience? Because we get more set in our ways, kind of?
Because we're
like, we know what's right, so...
Yeah, using an idea of what's right to justify, like, destructive behavior or harmful behavior or hateful behavior. You're like, well, I'm allowed to hate that person because they're doing the wrong thing and I know what's right. And that's my conscience telling me that I need to, tell them how they should be.
Right.
And I think in that way, it's justification of hatefulness. So I think it can be conflated, but I think in sort of the everyday Joe that's just trying to be a good dude, they generally know the difference.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think it does get trickier as you become more solidified with your worldview or your even spiritual view. Like, I run into a lot of really like hardcore evangelical Christians who are I just get a lot of sense a lot of hate from, because I feel like when people get more set and rigid in what they know is right, they're going to be more harsh on what they think is not right. And that's where they can blend this righteous voice and this sort of selfish, justifying voice. And I'm not perfect either. Like, I definitely have those as well. But it is interesting how the kind of the more we become spiritually what we think is right, the more dangers there are. Almost.
Yeah, definitely.
Did you go into that at all on your paper, or is that sort of too tangential?
No, that was too tangential. So there's just so much I could have talked about.
Yeah. Well, okay, so going back, we had those two things we were dissecting.
Yeah, one, sometimes there's a voice that's not conscience, which we just talked about.
Right.
And then sometimes conscience doesn't sound like a voice, or doesn't appear like a voice. And I think the times when conscience doesn't appear like a voice is when we're hearing that negative voice, when we're hearing sort of a pernicious voice.
Sorry, I don't want to jump on you, but I feel like my guess is that conscience then comes as a more of a gut feeling, like almost a pressure in the back of our head, like not a voice, but that's what at least my experience has been like in those times where I'm being tempted or there's that justification voice. I feel like there's just like a settled knowledge that surfaces as a pressure or feeling that this might not be my conscience talking. And
instead of it feeling like a separate entity, it feels like me, you. So I think that's what the real distinction is, because I think every person has a lower and higher part of themselves.
Like spiritually?
Spiritually, right. Yeah. Like they have a more base instinct, when...
I'm not going to hit Jimmy. Like that sort of thing?
Yeah, like any of those lower base things,
Right.
I'm really blanking on.
I mean, like, don't hit that person. Don't say this mean thing because it will do this. More of the negative sort of thing. Like, don't do this, don't do that. Or just it's nice to give a compliment, or it's nice to do a favor for someone.
Yeah, I think all of that things? Sort of simple things. And also, I think a lot of our negative behavior comes from us valuing lower things over higher things. Like a lower thing would be, I like to go out and have fancy dinners. Who doesn't? Who doesn't like to go out and have fancy dinners?
I've been thinking about.
Awesome.
I want to go back to the steakhouse. And I just want to do that so badly.
We should double date there.
Solid.
Except Brandy.
Our significant others would not enjoy it as much
not
as
make
we
use of it. It wouldn't.
I'll be there for 3 hours.
They wouldn't gorge themselves like we do. Anyway.
Nembraza, we're sponsored.
We're not. I wish. But yeah, like I like to have fancy dinners. I like to eat good food. But if I spend my money on fancy dinners instead of taking care of the people around me, if I was a married man with kids and I was like, well, I want to have a fancy dinner, so kids, see what you can scrounge up tonight.
Good luck.
Going out. That's clearly not good.
Well, I think there's a balance there, because even if you're a parent, you're still a person. So like if you wanted to have a date night with your wife, like I think that's cool.
Totally. I say that in a way of like, if you're neglecting something more important for something less important. Yeah. And it's just trying to elaborate that we have lower parts of ourselves and higher parts of ourselves.
Right. Getting back
and it's important to keep in mind which is which. And I think when we're identifying with the lower parts of ourselves, conscience sounds like a voice calling us up to something higher. We're like, man, I'm really mad. I really want to hit that person. And a little voice is like, but you shouldn't hit people. Right. And we're like, ugh. You're right. Yeah. And that's because we're identifying with our lower self. But I think when we're identifying with our higher self and we hear a voice being like, no, it's okay. Like just this one time, you just won't do it next time. Yeah, when we hear a voice from our lower self and we recognize like, oh, that's not conscience. It's because we're identifying with our conscience. We see it as who we are. And I think that's really the end goal.
Yeah, it's to stay in that upper tier level. So it's like we're sort of in flux. Like there are all these versions of ourselves that we can choose at any given time. And so maybe, I mean, there might be more than two, but if we just look at it as two, we're somewhere in between most of the time. And sometimes we're at our more base spiritual instinct, and sometimes we're at our higher spiritual instinct. And the voices we hear correlate or like to where we are.
Yeah, or rather correlate to where we aren't. Trying to pull us.
I guess I was looking at that to see where we are.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah, it's cool. It's a really cool
and like
idea.
Even if we can keep that in our minds, that's an interesting way to be able to reflect in the moment and see, okay, and where am I in this moment? Am I at a more base instinct? Do I need to raise myself up, or is something trying to pull me down from where I am?
Yeah,
and kind of looking at that in a sort of meta way to figure out what to do in a certain scenario or where our conscience is.
I mean, that idea of self-reflection, I think, is so important in anyone's personal, spiritual, or moral growth. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting. I think that lower voice that we were talking about, I think, is what in religious lingo, the voice of temptation. Mm-hmm. It's a voice telling us not
to change. We're great as is.
Or to give up on something we're trying to be. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people, when they are tempted to do a bad thing, when there's this idea of, I want to be this way, and all of a sudden there's this voice telling me to be this way, people can take it as discouraging. They're like, man, I thought I was better than this. Why do I still want to do that? You know, I thought I had conquered my anger problems. Like, why do I still feel like I want to hit people so much? But in reality, that shouldn't be discouraging, because what that means is that we've chosen something higher, and now those lower things give us pause, and we're disgusted by them. Like, of course I wouldn't hit that person. And maybe that's not what we used to think. Maybe we used to just hit people, you know? Mm-hmm. And so getting these like pangs of temptation is actually a sign that we're growing. And yeah, eventually they'll lessen and lessen as we conquer them. As we conquer them or
overcome them.
Yeah.
Move past it, whatever you want to say.
Yeah, but I know for myself, if I'm working on some sort of spiritual change, if I'm trying to be a better person in some way, and then I have a strong urge to go against that, it can feel really discouraging. It can feel like, I'm never gonna kick this.
Yeah.
But in actuality, it's because we've made a commitment to change that this is even a conflict at all. So I think that's just a cool way of reframing when we're identifying with our conscience, sort of the struggle that arises as a result. Yeah, so I really enjoyed writing this paper. I thought it was really cool.
Well, yeah, I love the ideas that you gave me there and that we got, because I feel like it's hard. I don't know. Some of what I was getting out of this was seeing and being able to feel and experience when the hells are attacking you. Because like this is a phrase like hells or demons attacking you is one that's popular in like Christian jargon. Mm-hmm. But I always get visual imagery of like literal black-winged beasts flying at you. But those evil spirits are part of our experience. So when we're that little like justifying voice or that temptation or that voice telling us that we're disgusting or can never change, like in those moments, that's when evil spirits are attacking us. And it's hard to recognize that in the moment, because you do have this conflict of whether that's conscience or whether that's those evil spirits. But like those are the times when evil spirits are attacking us.
Yeah, and I think there are different ways, there are different lenses to frame this negative force. I think there's great use in framing it as the bad parts of ourselves, because we need to get rid of it. And there's also truth in saying that those are actually real negative forces out there that are affecting us and telling us that those are parts of us that we can't get rid of them. And I think the greatest strength that humanity has is its ability to change.
Yeah.
Which is just such a freeing idea to be like, anything I have
doesn't have to be
me. Yeah. Like, I can choose to get rid of this. If I don't want it, if it's not helping me, I don't have to have it.
Yeah.
And of course,
and it's tough.
Easier said than done.
Yeah, way easier said than done. And like,
for sure,
we have to be cognizant of people's past experiences that have been like traumatic for them and made it really difficult for them to have like quote unquote like normal lives or to experience good things. But it is freeing. Like, we even see and hear of times when, like, I forget what the German philosopher was, but he was trapped in a prison camp in World War II. And he was so depressed and so like just in an awful place, obviously. Then he was doing a lot of thinking, because that's the only freedom he had was his mind. And he came to a conclusion that I can choose to not feel how I feel. I can choose to be free in my mind. And this opened up such a world to him that he didn't realize before. And that thought that we are constantly giving ourselves the power to change, to grow, to have our freedom of mind and pick what we want to listen to.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
And I think this, we need to back up a level to say that in our belief in the new church, we think that human beings are not just present on earth. And that sounds weird, but though we are physically present here, our minds, our souls are present in this spiritual world that is constantly around us. Like, just everywhere. Like, there's all kinds of spiritual things happening. So our minds, our souls are associating with these different spiritual things that are going on. So in moments where we feel our conscience speaking to us, or we feel those negative forces talking to us, it's because we are associated with these different good and evil spiritual things at all times.
Yeah, and I think
I don't know if you can explain that better than I can.
I think that can sound really like...
Sounds super weird.
Like weird, but I think people know that in a lot of ways. Like, people know that you can't get a bowl full of love. You know, people know that you can't go buy 3 ounces of friendship at a store. Like, these are clearly not natural things. And I think it's easy to explain them using brain chemistry and things like that.
Yeah, evolutionary chemistry.
But I think that our brains and our hormones and all that are vessels, basically are containers that our mind can work in. And I think our mind is different from our brain. Our brain is the physical matter that allows our mind to exist on Earth. But
that's trippy.
Yeah. I think if you really pressed a lot of people, they would think that the mind is not a natural thing. Because if
what do
you
you
really
guys think? Is the mind a natural thing?
Yeah. Feel free to comment. What do you think? But for me,
I think we can agree that the brain is a natural thing.
Yeah.
I'm trying to frame it like the brain is like the data analysis going on, like taking things in, putting things out, plugging in the numbers. But the interpreter or the force behind that is sort of our mind that is existing on a sort of different level.
Yeah, it's like a computer and its user.
Because we can also, like, the brain can analyze itself. Is sort of a way of framing, but it's kind of the mind analyzing the brain. Like, we can think about how we think, which makes us human. Like, that is a source of humanity, is thinking about what we think. And I think that relates to the mind being able to look at the brain and try to reform things.
Yeah, and I think it's clear to me that the mind affects the brain. And there is, of course, a back and forth relationship. The brain affects the mind as well. You know, when people have...
Just how the body can affect the mind, like our physical experience can affect our spirituality.
Yeah, like if people have clinical depression, it's not because they're sad in their mind and it's resulting. That's an imbalance in the body.
Brain chemistry, your body, yeah.
But I think in a mind with balanced hormonal interactions, if a person is feeling sad, they can think their way to cheering themselves up. I've done that before. I've been feeling down. Yeah, it's definitely hard. Where I've been feeling down and been like, you know what? I don't need to be feeling down about this right now.
Yeah.
Like this isn't helping me to feel, just to be wallowing in this. And I start thinking about good things in my life and how maybe I was making this one problem more a bigger deal than it really was. And in sort of thinking through it, I cheer myself up. And so I'm thinking about the fact that I'm sad and then creating a different reality from it, which is clearly, to me at least, the mind affecting brain chemistry to, release all these endorphins and blah, 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 blah.
Yeah. And I think that in turn can affect our body, because when we're in, or at least when I'm in those moments of sadness or depression, usually it starts with the mindset of, okay, I need to get a catalyst, find something to switch up my process. And usually that descends into my body being like, okay, I need to switch up what I'm physically doing right now, whether it's like get out of my room, go see someone, go exercise, or do something to change up the system. So I think it's this cool kind of like back and forth, like ping pong between our mind and our body affecting each other. And I think also going back to conscience, our mind kind of hosts our conscience. We can feel that conscience is outside of ourselves, just like our ability to think about what we're thinking about is a little bit outside of ourselves. Yeah. So do you think mind is the host of our conscience?
Yeah, I would say definitely. And I think there's sort of an interesting back and forth. People talk about sort of your mind and your heart. Mm-hmm. But I think the things you love, of course, do also exist in your mind. But I think there is truth in that there are sort of two parts of the mind. There's the part of our mind that loves, and the part of our mind that thinks, that rationalizes. And I think the conscience sort of partakes of both. Because, of course, if it's a little voice, it's a thought. It's the part of our mind that thinks, that rationalizes. Right. Is like, you really should be doing the right thing because you know it's the right thing. Like, come on. You don't need to be behaving this way. And that's sort of our conscience trying to convince us.
Right.
So it's in sort of the rational part of our mind. But then I think we wouldn't be having those thoughts if there wasn't something higher that we cared about. If there wasn't something higher that we valued. And so I think working on valuing higher things is the first step to creating a higher conscience. I think people start out the way they're raised forms a conscience in them, but not a formal conscience, because I think most of children's behavior is sort of risk versus reward behavior.
Yeah, I mean, we all start out like that.
Yeah, and so I think there are children who are nice and children who are well-behaved because they were taught if you're well-behaved, you'll get good stuff.
Yeah. And
your parents won't be mad at you. And, your friends will like you more. And there's nothing wrong with this. I mean, it's these sort of natural barriers are really, really useful things for everyone. Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think it evolves as you grow up too. Like we started as kids having that like, okay, do this, you'll get this. A plus B equals C sort of deal. And then as we start to develop our rationality, our ability to think and be more logical and adult, it becomes more of a like civil law. Like, okay, this is the law of our nation or our country or whatever. So abide by that, we'll do well. And then as we start to get more logical, we start going into like moral law and then spiritual law, and it gets more complex as you are more rational, as you can take in and follow these different systems a little bit.
Yep. And I think...
And you also start to set them for yourself, rather than having them be set by other people. Like when you're a kid, it's set by your parents. When you're a little bit older, it's set by the government. Not that we don't obey the government anymore, but like you move past that to setting your own spiritual self, sort of.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that a lot. And I think just because we've moved past it doesn't mean that we don't also rely on it. I think it's sort of foundational.
It's like pyramid-like sort of, I don't know.
Because there are definitely times where, you know I shouldn't say spiteful things, and so I don't because I'm like, oh, it's the right thing to do. Mm-hmm. And then there are times where I really, really want to, and I don't because I don't want to deal with the repercussions of like someone being mad at me and having to deal with that whole thing, the guilt of making someone upset,
right.
And like all this, like all the drama that's going to erupt if I say that thing. And then there are sometimes that I just say spiteful things, I mean, everybody messes up. But so I think those lower levels are a really useful sort of fail-safe when our conscience doesn't get the better of us, when we fall short of the ideal we're trying to strive for, falling back on those sort of more natural barriers to doing the wrong thing.
Yeah, and I think that's why they're kind of in place and originally is to prevent those sort of things or act as that foundation, which is really useful.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think any government or any country wants a populace that is only following strict civil laws. I think any country is a much better place when people are sort of living the spirit of those laws, living the morals that formed those laws and trying to live a life that they don't have to think about like, oh, am I breaking a law here? They're just doing the right thing.
Right.
But of course, it's
hard to be that simple.
Yeah. There's all sorts of flaws in the world, and people, it's hard to know what the right thing to do is, and it's hard to know if the laws are right.
And I think it is kind of cool, though, how these civil laws or parental laws help form our conscience in different ways. Like our conscience is developed by our environment, mostly. We do all have it sort of innately, but like you see kids feel guilty about things because their conscience is starting to form based off what they've learned in their lives. Mm-hmm. And it's like that's just how human beings are. And then when we get old enough, we can start to question our conscience and try to develop it for ourselves. So I think that's a neat process.
Yeah. And it's interesting to think about what that conscience really is. Getting back to the idea of like it being a voice, and getting back to our idea of like when we were talking about sort of that negative voice, that lower voice, it being useful to identify it as ourselves, sometimes bad parts of ourselves that we want to change, and also it being useful at times to identify it as an outside force trying to manipulate us.
Right.
And I think that's...
And looking at externally where we are in this moment and where we want to be.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
And I think the same is true with conscience. And there are times where it's really useful to be like, no, I don't want to do that. I want to behave better than this. The person I want to be wouldn't do this. But I think it's also can be useful at times to see this as a positive force that wants good for us. A voice from heaven, angels saying, hey, like we're here to support you. In the same way that there are people that want to hurt you, there are people that want to help you.
Right. Those positive spirits and negative spirits around us at once. Yeah.
And I think it's also really useful to think about that conscience as the voice of a higher power, the voice of God. Because I think in reality, good things are from God. And so if we are wanting a good thing, that's God speaking to us.
Yeah.
And so
we can go into how God interacts with us.
Yeah.
That's a whole different
topic. It's a whole.
We should probably start to wrap up though.
Yeah. So it's just cool to be able to see the uses of looking at it through different lenses. And this is another thing that I think the doctrine of the new church is really cool about, framing things differently, because I think people connect with ideas in different ways.
Right.
And when you sort of come at an idea from different angles, you not only get a fuller picture of the idea, but also people have different ways of connecting to it, which I think is cool.
That is cool. So, any other takeaways from your paper, or any like wrap up paper comments?
Well, yeah, the end of my paper is talking about how we actually work to create a conscience, although everyone has a conscience to some degree. So it's really, by create a conscience, I mean perfect our conscience, make it better.
Yeah. Well, we can't ever
raise
have a
it
perfect
higher.
conscience.
Yeah. I mean, it never gets perfect, just like it never
perfect.
Just like it never doesn't exist. You know, it's always there to some degree. And sort of that idea of, it's important for our conscience to, first of all, learn what's true. And learn what's true and accept it for ourselves, you know? And another cool thing that it was talking about something that it called spurious conscience.
Spurious?
Yeah, which means
that makes me think of like cowboys with spurs.
It means like imitation conscience, but I think that word can have a worse connotation than the idea. It's basically, if people accept things as true that are not really true, but live loyally by them because they want to do the right thing, that is, in many ways, a conscience. Of course, it's not a conscience that's necessarily leading them in the right direction. They could have... But,
are they faulted for that?
No. Right. And it talks about how, basically, the moment the person learns what's right, or learns a better idea about how to live, they would immediately love it and accept it, because...
Well, I think. Sorry, I don't want to cut you off.
No, go for it.
I was gonna say, well, I think we all then have spurious conscience to some degree.
Of course.
Like, the truth that we decide to live by is always our best guess. Like, even if we're so solid in our faith and our belief, it's still our best guess as to what is the right belief. Like, everyone is like that.
Yep.
So we all, to some degree, have a spurious conscience.
Yeah,
and I think the best thing there is to live, and this is just my opinion, to live your life like there could be something better out there and be ready to change for that.
Yeah.
Because that's where we run into trouble, going back to those people who have such rigid beliefs, is not having the capability to adopt something that might make your life better, make you a better spiritual person, or make you happier.
Yeah, and also not be frozen by the fear of maybe this isn't the most right thing. You know, this idea of there's a type of conscience being formed as long as you're living by what you think is true. The idea of, like, you know, we're all just going off our best guess.
Right.
And you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to know exactly what's true.
And there's not one thing out there that as soon as you find it, you're done. Like, we don't have to be constantly scared that we're not perfect, or we don't have the exact right belief. Like, we don't have to be so overwhelmed with that. And I think that idea of spurious conscience is kind of freeing in a way.
Yeah.
It's not saying you're good how you are, never change, everything's great. It's saying live your life to the best of your ability by the truths that you find and you choose to adopt.
Yeah, it's basically like, I mean, do the best you can and things will work out. Like,
and be constantly trying to do better.
Yeah,
I love
exactly.
That. Spurious conscience. That is cool.
And yeah, so it creates this sort of spectrum between the fake conscience I was talking about, like not doing things just because you don't want negative repercussions for yourself, which is not really a conscience, but is useful at times, through this spurious conscience up to true conscience, which is, you know, I have the right idea and I'm living my life by it. And I think everyone is on that spectrum, and also in a way a mixed bag. You know, I might have a true conscience about one thing, but a false conscience about another. Like, I do this thing because it's right and I love it and want to do it because it's right. Yeah. But over here, that's more of a struggle for me.
Yeah, and I think those more complicated issues are where we fall in that spurious conscience thing.
Yeah.
Like, I'd say I'm like 90% sure true conscience is saying, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. You know, very simple truths, like 10 Commandments sort of things that are prevalent throughout all kinds of beliefs. Mm-hmm. But I think 70% of the time we're in that spurious conscience state where things are kind of gray and we don't really know, but we're trying our best.
Yep.
So that goes back to those levels we were talking about with your base instinct, your highest instinct, and then your spurious conscience in between.
Yep.
Ooh, I like this.
Yeah, again, it's so cool how applicable it is and how much it's like, hey, the world is a messy place and we're all just trying to do the best we can here.
And here's some tools that we think are pretty good.
Yeah, and here's a way to understand what we're working with.
Yeah.
And I think being able to have a way to comprehend how our mind works and what is affecting our mind helps us perfect our mind, helps us raise our mind, helps us better ourselves.
Mm-hmm. It's very empowering.
Yeah.
Super empowering. That's awesome. Yeah. Well, do you have any other final comments? I'm feeling good.
No, yeah, I think that was mostly what I talked about. I finished it at 4:04 this morning.
And then called me.
And then I called you at 4:30. We were going to meet very early in the morning and do a
sleep-deprived spirituality.
Spirituality, which I am still doing, if I'm going to be honest.
You're running like 5 hours.
Yeah.
So thanks for tuning in to our weird spiritual deep dive here without a guest. But that was super fun. I really liked it. I'm feeling energized.
I like the idea of sort of having a couple of these every once in a while just to really hone in on something, like have a little workshop about a spiritual idea.
So if anyone has a spiritual idea that you're curious about or that you want more information on or you're struggling with, like, let us know and we can talk about that.
Yeah.
And also feel free to follow us on YouTube and Spotify and iTunes and Google Play, Apple Music, all these different things. We're up everywhere, so make sure you subscribe and follow in because it helps us out.
Yeah. And if you like what you heard, keep watching.
Yeah, and tell a friend. Thanks so much.
Bye.